All right, so with Darwin and his development of his theory, it was kind of based on two key points, and he presented evidence that many species that we see on Earth are descendants from ancestral species that were much different from those of modern species, and these descendants can be chronicled in the fossil record, much like Cuvier was saying, and the evidence that he was presenting was based on a lot of the things that he found when he was on his voyage on the Beagle, which we'll talk about soon. And the other kind of key point here was the idea of natural selection. And the mechanism by which these organisms are changing has to do with the interaction of these organisms with their environment, and that change through time of the populations of organisms to either become more or less fit for their environment. And when I use fit, that's more or less adapted to produce numerous offspring, which will allow those genes to essentially survive. Okay, our current understanding now with evolution is change through time, and that change is going to occur in the genetic composition. You're going to have these heritable characteristics within that population that are going to change, and if enough change occurs, that's going to accumulate within the genetics or the genome of the entire population, and that could give rise perhaps to a new species. Okay, so the idea that these organisms could change and that they were changing as a result of the interaction with their environment really was challenging a lot of the traditional beliefs of Western culture, and that was the idea that the Earth was only a few thousand years old and that all of the species that were alive now had been alive since the beginning of time when created by the Creator. Okay, and what Darwinism was doing more or less was it was challenging worldview. Okay, and people's kind of belief systems were being challenged. Okay, so when we look at the voyage on the Beagle, Darwin really was kind of lost in that he didn't know what he wanted to do. His family was very wealthy, and he tried to be a doctor, and couldn't stand the sight of the blood, and there was lots of things that he didn't really like to do. He was going to go into the clergy, but he was kind of discovering a lot of these types of things that were making him think twice, and so he didn't really know what he wanted to do. But because his family was so wealthy, and he liked being a naturalist, he started to travel around on the Beagle, and his father, secured this spot for him on the Beagle. And what the Beagle was doing is it was kind of traversing the world and kind of developing maps of the coastlines of the various continents and so forth. And his father paid for him to be able to go on the ship and paid for an assistant with him. And then while he was at these different ports collecting the specimens that he was collecting, he was able to put them in crates and send them back home to England, so that when he returned home, he'd have the ability to kind of go through and look at these things and kind of document all of the findings that he had. So it was obvious he came from a very wealthy family, and he was given this opportunity to go about it in large part due to this wealth. Okay, so there's a video here that I want to take a look at. Kind of shed some light on some of the things that we were talking about here. Okay.
No, thank you. No. No, no. No. Me, in the name of Charles Darwin. Yeah? Captain Fitzroy. Me, soy naturalista. Hueso. Bones. Yes, sí. Hueso gigante. Gigante. Aquí, here. Fitzroy.
A flood washed down part of a bank of earth.
Mi hijo le pegó con una piedra y le sacó los dientes. Por eso que se cayó tan afuera.
It was perfect, but the boys knocked out some of the teeth throwing stones at it.
How much? Quanto costa?
Un rifle, señor, un rifle.
I wonder why these creatures no longer exist.
Perhaps the ark was too small to allow them entry and they perished in the flood. What is there to laugh at?
Oh, nothing.
Nothing. Do you mock me or the Bible?
Neither.
What sort of clergyman will you be, Mr. Darwin?
Dreadful. Dreadful. And God said, let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that hath life, and fowl that may fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven. And God created great whales, and every living creature that moveth.
Hello.
Which the waters brought forth
What are you doing here?
after their kind.
Why such beauty when no one can see?
And every winged fowl after his kind.
You can't have been blown here.
And God saw that it was good.
If I were to give a prize for the single best idea anybody ever had, I'd give it to Darwin for the idea of natural selection. Ahead of Newton, ahead of Einstein, because his idea unites the two most disparate features of our universe. The world of purposeless, meaningless matter and motion on the one side, and the world of meaning and purpose and design on the other. He understood that what he was proposing was a truly revolutionary idea.
The Darwinian Revolution is about who we are. It's what we're made of. It's what our life means insofar as science can answer that question. So it, in many ways, was the singularly deepest and most discombobulating of all discoveries that science has ever made.
In Darwin's day, the idea of evolution was regarded as highly unorthodox because it went against all of natural history in Great Britain. It jeopardized the standing of science. It did jeopardize the standing of a stable society, the Bible, and the church as well. Darwin kept his thoughts to himself for many years and agonized over the problem. If it ever got out that he was doing something that ran slap counter to established science, would ruin his career, ruin his reputation. He was a respectable man with a dangerous theory.
All right, so that kind of give you a little bit of background into some of the things that Darwin was kind of going through as he was developing his theory. And his ride on the Beagle, you know, you saw him there kind of reading book. He was reading The Principles of Geology from Lyell, among many other books, and what his ideas of kind of the natural world and uniformitarianism and these types of things, as he was kind of rattling those things around. As you know anything about the west coast, perhaps, of South America, which is where there's the Andes Mountains and part of the Pacific Ring of Fire and that sort of a thing. There's often earthquakes and volcanoes and tsunamis and things like that. And when he was riding on the Beagle through this area, he observed a gigantic earthquake that resulted in a tsunami and the uplifting of the earth by probably, I think it's like 11 feet or something like that. And it really got him thinking about the things that Lyell was talking about, the things that he was witnessing, and you know, started to solidify the notion that, you know, the environment is changing and it's going to change the organisms. And then further exploration, when he was kind of walking through the Andes and such and collecting specimens, he started to notice that there were seashells and a lot of fossils and organisms high up in the Andes that only could have gotten there as a result of, you know, eons of time, these earthquakes and things continually, you know, creating this uplift. And that's where he realized that an immense amount of time could have led to a lot of these types of changes. And he was also realizing that the physical evidence was not supporting his traditional view and the things that he was taught when he was growing up. And these ideas really sparked an interest in him. And when he got to the Galapagos and started witnessing all of these different types of organisms, from the sea turtles and the different shapes of their shells on the backs of the turtles, and the different types of finches that were there, and all of these types of things that he of these specimens that he was collecting, he just started collecting them and sending them back to England. And he didn't notice any of the significance of these until he returned home to England and began to look at them. And once he was back home, he started to notice the different kind of features of these organisms, all of the organisms, from the sea turtles to the finch species to the they look like little salamanders. They're little lizards that are floating around in the water. They eat the seaweed and stuff. So he collected all sorts of birds and things. And what he was basically kind of arriving at when he was looking at these finch species is that somehow there must have been an organism, a finch organism, on the mainland of South America that had gotten blown off course and ended up into the islands. And when it got to the islands, they basically radiated outward into all of the different islands. And because they weren't mixing and mingling together, they were basically giving rise to these new species. And that's how we got the many new types of species on the island. And this also, on the trip and once he got back home in England, this is where he started to really kind of pin down the major kind of features of his theory of natural selection, his idea of evolution. But he was very reluctant to publish this because he knew the outrage that it would cause. And he was continually being urged to publish, even by people that may have disagreed with some of the things that he was saying, or some of the kind of conjecture that was being made that went against the notion of the Bible. He was still being urged to publish this because he knew that there was a lot of other naturalists out there that were working on it. And Lyell was one of his really good friends and close confidants, and he kept urging him to publish these ideas because he knew someone else might beat him to it. Okay? And many of you have probably not heard of Alfred Russel Wallace before, but he was a guy, a British naturalist, certainly not of the same social class as Charles Darwin, and really was rather poor and was moving around the East Indies and studying a lot of the types of things that Darwin was studying. And he basically, because of Darwin's kind of social standing, sent him a paper and asked him what he thought of his ideas, which were just like the ones that Darwin was proposing. And so basically, Darwin had a great admiration for, Wallace had great admiration for Darwin. And when Darwin kind of told him what they would do, both of these guys, their papers were kind of jointly presented, really without much fanfare, at the British Royal Society for their theories of natural selection. And it wasn't until Darwin wrote The Origin of Species that these things really started to become as controversial as they were. Okay, so what I want to do is watch this last video here with Bill Nye and kind of look at some more of the natural history and really the history behind what Darwin was doing. Okay.
In the 1820s, surgery was a grisly affair. There was no anesthesia, and young medical students were forced to watch and learn. The young man who walked out that day was Charles Darwin. The ordeal of the operating room was too much for him. Over his father's objections, he quit medical school to pursue his dream of becoming a naturalist. Darwin was hired as a naturalist aboard the British Admiralty's HMS Beagle, which embarked on an expedition to survey and map coastal waters around the world. The Beagle was at sea for 5 years. To Darwin, it seemed an eternity. He shared a small cabin with the captain, with whom he had several disagreements, including the story of creation. While the captain held to the Bible's account of creation, Darwin believed that the earth had changed slowly over millions of years. There was a debate that would follow Darwin for the rest of his life. The British government paid for this?
No, actually, Darwin's father paid for his voyage and also paid for an assistant to come with Darwin and help him skin the specimens and prepare the crates for shipment. He worked in a little poop deck where he had all his specimens, just about something like this.
The Beagle made stopovers in ports from Australia to South America, including 36 days in the Galapagos Islands. And Darwin made the most of it. He recorded extensive observations about the indigenous plants and wildlife. He collected and preserved thousands of specimens for study. For years after the voyage, Darwin would recall the observations he made while aboard the Beagle.
It was not until 1837, a couple of years after he returned from the Galapagos, that he opened his first species notebook, and he asked himself the question, very ambitious question for a man in his late 20s, what are the laws of life?
Is this Darwin's whole point?
It was Darwin's whole point, to try to find laws operating in the natural world similar to the laws that physicists and chemists had found in inorganic nature.
Darwin's search to understand the laws of nature took shape as he studied the animals on the Galapagos Islands. Of special interest to him were the physical differences within a certain species. For example, the finches on the Galapagos had different shaped beaks. They varied according to the environments where the finches lived. Some had beaks that were hard and blunt, ideal for hammering open crab shells. Others had beaks that were more tapered and suited for hunting and pecking among rocks. The difference was puzzling. As Darwin analyzed it, he began thinking about how the struggle to survive was the driving force behind all life. If the species is to thrive in its environment, it has to evolve or perish. With this simple yet powerful insight, history was made. Darwin discovered the mechanism that made evolution work, the process of natural selection. Darwin wasn't the first guy really to come up with this, right? What was his special or particular insight?
He was the first to come up with a specific mechanism, that is natural selection. He was the first to popularize the idea of deep time, millions of years that this process involved. He was the first to popularize the idea of the tree of life, in which we're related to all living things. The great geneticist Dobzhansky once said, nothing in biology makes sense without evolution. Because biology today is evolutionary biology. That's what biology is all about, and has been all about since 1859. How we got here, what kind of creatures we are, how we're related to everything else in nature. It's been established we are all part of one great tree of life, plugged into a bloodline, to a DNA that links us to every living thing on Earth. That's not metaphorical. That's literal.
Why did it take Darwin 20 years to publish his ideas?
He knew there would be a storm of religious protest. His own wife was not happy that he was going to write things that were incompatible with the Bible. She wrote him a letter when they were first married saying, I hope that your science will not lead us to spend eternity in two very different places.
Wow.
And she was seriously concerned about this. Plus, he was trying to build up a mountain of evidence that would be incontrovertible.
Finally, in 1859, Darwin published his theory of natural selection. His book, Origin of Species, is considered one of the greatest books ever written. People talk about the theory of evolution, right? But Darwin was the guy that said, well, there isn't any absolute truth here.
Darwin, being one of the first modern thinkers, tried to tell us that science is provisional. It changes.
What do you mean by provision?
It means it's the best truth you have at the moment. And when you get more data that can't be explained that way, then you have to get a new theory. So it's not an eternal truth. It's a provisional truth. It changes. And he did not want evolution to be accepted as a dogma or a creed. He would have been the first to say, throw it out if you got something better.
But we didn't find anything
We
better.
didn't find anything better. In fact, what we found was that entire new sciences that were undreamed of in Darwin's day have come up through the study of molecular genetics and DNA, which reinforce the idea of evolution, so that now everywhere we look today, we see something that came from Darwin in science.
Okay, so that kind of summarized some of the things that we were talking about with Darwin and his kind of development of his theory and so forth. Okay, so that takes care of part 2. So we're going to pick up with part 3 here in a little bit. If you got any questions, of course, write them down and we'll talk to you soon.